Our next segment, and I'll ask Councillor Brown to come forward to introduce the panel discussion on rural Victorian population growth and workforce development. Councillor Brown.
Thanks very much, Rob. I think obviously there's been a lot of discussion about population today, and I think Rural Councils Victoria has certainly been a significant contributor to that discussion over the last 12 to 2 years. So today we've got Rural Councils Victoria commissioned a couple of pieces of work which address some of the issues around population. And so I've got great pleasure in introducing the two presenters. Some of you will have heard Paul Shipp and John Stevens present at the April Forum, and so they're going to talk about their final reports, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers. My fellow board member, Andrew Mason, who seems to have, oh, there he is, good, will be doing the wrap-up. So I've got great pleasure in introducing Paul Shipp from Urban Enterprise. Paul's company have done a piece of work on the rural population strategy, and there is an executive summary in your package. The full report is available on the RCV website, and it's certainly well worth a read. There's some very interesting statistics in there, but also some interesting proposals in what can be done to increase population in rural areas. The second speaker today will be John Stevens from Dench, McClean, Carlson, and his firm have completed a piece of work about rural workforce development. And we've already had a discussion from Jack Archer in terms of the gaps that have been identified in rural and regional communities and unable to fill jobs that are available. I think one of the challenges, and we all need to work on this, is to change the conceptions about rural communities. There are great opportunities out there. We are not a second-rate option. People don't need to be forced to live in rural and regional communities. There are great economic opportunities. There are beautiful lifestyles in great natural environments. So I think we need to change the national narrative about that. And I get quite angry when I hear federal politicians talking about regional visas to make people stay in regional areas. We choose to live in those areas because it's a great lifestyle, and we need to get that story out there. And these research studies provide evidence that support what those opportunities are. So I'll hand over to Paul and John. Thank you.
Quite a lot of you would have heard me speak at the previous forum. Can't believe it's 6 months ago already, but a lot's been happening in that 6-month period. So what I'm hoping to do today is not to recap all the numbers and the research that I've already presented to most of you, but to talk about where the discussion and the policy context is actually heading. I'll recap on what the key findings actually were of our research, what our intended actions and what our report actually covers in the executive summary and in the full version, which is quite a hefty document with a lot of research. And then I'd like to touch on, as I mentioned, where some of the more recent policy announcements, the narrative at a federal and state level is actually heading, and what I think about that, and what is in favour of RCV and some of the objectives that are being worked on very hard across the organisation. I can look down here, can't I? Okay, so just a very quick recap. We started this work in late 2017, so it's been going on for quite a while. There was quite a robust piece of research, consultation and analysis, and then in conjunction with the board, worked on some findings and some initiatives. As I mentioned, 6 months ago, I presented the key findings of the progress. In July 2018, our report was released, so it's now available on the RCV website. And today I'd just like to touch on mainly the back end of those findings. The key findings around the challenge. Rural Victoria is not homogenous. There's not one rural Victoria. You all know that. Rural Victoria is receiving a declining share of the state's population. So most of the growth, as you know, is going to metropolitan Melbourne. There are some areas of rural Victoria, as you know, that are declining. It's particularly important. The question sometimes is asked, well, is that a problem? At a state level, at a federal level, by those outside this room, ask the question, is this actually a problem? It's macroeconomics at work. People find the work where it is, and people are attracted by education and agglomeration of economies in CBDs. It's happening all over the world. But what we found is that it is a problem. Certainly the rural councils themselves, as I'm sure you're aware, so 80% of rural councils responded that they consider that population attraction is a very important issue, so the highest ranking of importance in the survey that we put out. Most importantly, existing skills and labour force shortages are restricting economic activity. So there are a lot of examples of businesses that are export businesses that have not been able to access the labour that they need to expand and respond to global opportunities. So that's essentially foregone economic benefit and productivity growth because of a lack of access to labour and population in rural Victoria. Particularly important is that the working age population in some areas is actually going backwards. Last time I put up some numbers around some red and some green, and I probably should have flashed that up again, but to describe it, some areas, although the population is growing or remaining relatively constant, the population of working age is actually going backwards. And that is a problem that's often hidden by some of the data that you can see in terms of pure population numbers. In terms of what's happening now, so there are a range of current state government, and we're focusing mainly on the role of the state government through this research. There are a range of initiatives that exist that seek to support population retention and attraction in rural and regional Victoria, which is great. And we commend the state government for actually coming up with a range of different incentives. And they are being expanded and strengthened incrementally, or I suppose in an ad hoc way, in terms of things like payroll tax discounts and first homeowner grants for regional Victoria that are boosted compared to metropolitan areas. What we say about that is that many of those initiatives are very broad. They're small financial incentives. They're actually resulting in a lot of benefit primarily to regional centres and not much impact in rural areas. There's not really a differentiation between how those initiatives and incentives are set out between rural and regional. And most importantly, there's no overall population vision or target. That is the most important message that comes through our research. And if you read through and look at our priority actions, it really is about the importance of leadership, the importance of responsibility at a state government level. I heard the discussion around the role of a Minister for Rural Victoria or a Minister for Decentralisation. That's the kind of government-led responsibility and accountability that we think is missing, despite the fact that the current state government is seeking to implement various initiatives. It's the overarching direction, strategy and commitment that we are recommending. We put a lot of research of literature and international case studies and local case studies into the report, so you'll see that it's grounded in research. What best practice is in terms of moving people, and it's not really about moving people, it's about attracting people. I heard the introduction and that trying to force people to be somewhere doesn't work, and I completely agree with that, and the research shows that it's pull factors. Pull factors are the most important way to encourage people to be in certain areas. The two highest priority and most effective pull factors are employment and lifestyle. If there's a job and a great lifestyle, people will come. It's not necessarily about forcing people to move, and it's certainly not necessarily about providing only financial incentives. Financial incentives are part of the deal, and they work to some extent in case studies, but really it's those employment and lifestyle pull factors that will encourage people to move rather than forcing. International migration and internal migration to Victoria is really strong. That is a major opportunity, particularly international migration. You'll see a series of actions around second move migration in our report, which is around new migrant groups by default often and by familiarity coming to major cities, but often bringing skills in rural industries, not always skills in rural industries, often across the full gamut of industries that are needed, those skills in rural Victoria, but second move migration is a key objective and area to target in our report. And partnerships are required. So the state government can't do everything. There's essentially the need for partnerships across business sectors, education institutions. There is a role for the federal government and clearly for local government in bringing all of these things together. The state government has a relatively limited array or range of levers that it can push and pull to influence population movement, but they are a key player, especially in terms of leadership and strategy at the state level. Some of the research that we did, and you might remember me talking about this last time, is that local governments all across rural Victoria are trying to address this issue, but often say that they don't have the resources, they don't have the impetus and the leadership from either a regional area or a state government to actually effect meaningful change. And RCV's playing a very important role in trying to bring this issue to a head. I won't touch on the opportunities. I think the opportunities are quite clear, but those are some of the opportunities that we identified. Lastly, there is policy support from across the different spectrum, and that's something that, as you know, is quite rare. All parties are putting forward policies and announcements really to try and acknowledge and respond to the challenge and the opportunities that we're putting forward. And as John mentioned when we were discussing in the conversation prior to this session offline, he mentioned that when we started this work back in 2017, it was something of a vacuum around this issue. There wasn't much being spoken about. It may have been the time in the political cycle, maybe what RCV is doing is really creating greater awareness, and I know regional cities Victoria is also creating a lot greater awareness of this issue at the moment, and some of the challenges are really coming to bear in metropolitan Melbourne, and the media is picking up this issue time and time again. There is a lot of momentum behind this issue at the moment, so it's the right time to encourage action. So the policy and actions that we came up with, the policy statement really just gives you a flavour of what we're seeking to achieve through numerous actions and objectives. A more coordinated, committed and targeted approach to population attraction and retention is needed at the state government level. Central to this is the development of a rural and regional population strategy which seeks to achieve published population targets and is overseen by a Minister for Rural Victoria. That's the policy statement, and there's a lot of depth and it's a complex issue. So I won't run through all of the different objectives and actions. You'll have the opportunity in your own time, if you're interested in this issue, to read through our report. The priority objectives are that, one, rural Victoria is strongly represented in the state parliament or in the state government. So we encourage RCV and its members to advocate for the establishment of a government portfolio and a Minister for Rural Victoria. Responsibility and accountability and a direct line to the government is critical if there is a decentralisation agenda, no matter which party is in power. And two, prepare a rural and regional population strategy, as I mentioned. There need to be targets. We recommend to build on the various population scenarios that we've put forward in our report. We're not talking about exploding the rural population. So the projections are for growth in the order of around 30,000 people. I can't remember what time frame that's over, but we're talking about adding another 20,000 people onto that. So it's not talking about exploding the population across rural Victoria, but we think that can have some quite meaningful economic benefits to rural areas, not least of which is to retain and maintain a sustainable settlement hierarchy. Some of the research that we've done previously has shown that small towns are getting smaller and large towns are getting larger. And that's a problem not necessarily for the economies of the towns, but for service provision in particular. As you know, once you get below certain thresholds of population, it becomes difficult to support things like medical care, education, community services, etc. So if we get to a position where if we don't act, and if the state government doesn't act, we could find ourselves in a position where the settlement hierarchy of certain parts of rural Victoria is put under significant threat if there's an ongoing decline in some of those, particularly those secondary and tertiary rural centres that are very critical in supporting the outlying agricultural rural areas and very small settlements. I think I've used up a bit of my time already, but I just wanted to touch on, as I mentioned, there is a groundswell of announcements at the moment, and so many of the government announcements at different levels are focusing on this issue. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of a wrap-up and a snapshot of what's being announced. I'm sure you're all very aware of what a lot of these announcements are, but just to put it all into context, this is a federal issue at the moment. So the federal government finally have waded into this issue and acknowledged that they are the holder of the immigration lever, and their influence over population growth at a macro level is very significant, and that there really needs to be not only an opening of a floodgate, so to speak, but also some strategic responses to where those migrants in particular and where national settlement strategies need to head in terms of optimising and ensuring that there are benefits from the migration program. So Minister Tudge is now the Minister for Cities, Urban Infrastructure and Population at a federal level. That's a very new position. Although there have been various ministers for cities over the last couple of years, it's been a bit of a revolving door, but very recently in October he announced his plan to direct new migrants to smaller states or regions, matching the skills of new migrants with skills shortages in rural and regional Victoria. How you do that and how the federal government seek to do that is up for debate, and clearly the use of visa controls to force people to be in certain areas is contestable, but the real benefit of this is that there is federal level involvement in this issue now, which I think is a really positive response. And a public service decentralisation agenda also has been announced. I think decentralisation of public services is one way to stimulate job growth. It's not the answer though. Rural and regional centres thrive where there's specialisation in a particular industry. If decentralisation leads to specialisation in a particular industry, that stimulates further supply chain benefits to the economy. If decentralisation plonks 50 jobs in one spot and nothing else changes, you get 50 jobs in the public service in one location and a few more retail dollars being spent, but it's not going to change the game. Importantly, I think the Planning Institute of Australia has been very vocal and yesterday released their National Settlement Strategy. So they are very keen to acknowledge that long-term planning is very important when you are experiencing population growth in some areas and population decline in others. So this is very much a planning issue: land supply, infrastructure, being able to respond to challenges to existing settlement hierarchies. So I'm going to have a close look at that settlement strategy at a national level that was released yesterday. The current state government, as I mentioned, is announcing a range of initiatives, a lot around infrastructure. There are those existing smaller incentives around payroll tax discounts, first homeowner grants, the marketing campaign, Ready When You Are. There are initiatives there, and as I say, those are supported and very positive initiatives, but they're relatively ad hoc and there's no defined strategy or policy that is tangible and that can be taken away and responded to by the various ministries to actually achieve a particular agenda. So that's what we would say about making sure there's a committed and targeted strategy to this issue. You've just heard from Matthew Guy around their proposed population commission, really seeking to predict likely population levels and setting localised population limits. That really relates as much to metropolitan Melbourne as it does to rural Victoria. So there's still a lot of meat to go on those bones, but it's very positive in my view that the opposition is really promoting this agenda that then hopefully flows through to more local benefits for rural Victoria. And a lot of the initiatives that have been announced align reasonably well with where our work landed. So it's good to see that there's some, as I mentioned, essentially bipartisan in principle support for this issue. And the last slide that I've got is just some of the reactions. So this is quite a contested issue, certainly in the media. Melbourne's population explosion threatens to create a Bangkok situation. It can become quite emotive. So I think what we've done is try and put as many facts on the ground as we possibly can about this issue. There is a relative lack of evidence about this issue around, despite the importance of the issue. One thing that we have recommended as an action is a more consistent approach at the state government level to researching and collecting data to be able to demonstrate and understand why people move, where they move, and what's likely to encourage them to move in the future, so that there's an ongoing accumulation of evidence around this topic. So that's all I wanted to cover. Thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to ask me any questions afterwards or offline about the content of the report or how we think this issue can be best progressed, please do. And I look forward to your questions in a moment. Thank you.
Good afternoon all. Great to see many of you again. Oh, sorry, well, all of you again, but many familiar faces. My name's John Stevens. I'm a director of Dench, McClean, Carlson. We had the opportunity to work on workforce development plan. Like Paul, I'm going to do a quick sprint through some of the background, but I want to really highlight the issues. So we've seen great jobs growth in rural Victoria in that census period, and I suppose we had to dispel a bit of a myth for some that while rural Victoria takes up the bulk of the state, it doesn't take up the bulk of the jobs, but it does have some important assets that are unique to rural Victoria. One of the biggest challenges we've got at the present moment is draw a line through that rate of growth. So, you know, over the last 3 census periods, we saw 3%, 3%, 15%. We've had immense growth in the last 5 years, which has been both an opportunity but also a challenge. So extraordinary growth. So in terms of the challenge for rural Victoria is the competition for workers. And that's one of the big challenges that comes out of that growth. There's been growth across the state. So despite a contraction in population in some areas, we still managed to achieve, small in some cases, jobs growth right across the state, but dominated by the peri-urban LGAs. So again, that's a great opportunity, but it also presents some challenges in terms of, as Paul already flagged, we're seeing a decline in the working age population in many of the LGAs. That's a significant issue. I'm not going to go through every line of that, but that's just to give you an overview of which sectors grew overall. I should say that the industry sectors described there are ANZIC industry code language. That's not the way that normal people talk, but hopefully you can glean from those sectors what they mean. Very quickly, health services. 50% of health services are in doctors, nurses, physiotherapists, etc., etc. The other 50% of health services are around residential and supported care. We need to make provision for greater investment in that because we are seeing a fast-growing 65-year-old population in rural Victoria. We saw a huge turnaround in agricultural employment. In that period that I flagged before, from 2001 to 2011, we saw nearly 10,000 people go out of the agricultural workforce, and you can see that more than nearly 6,000 have come back in. So it's very volatile. People were talking about the impact of drought before. What we saw previously was the impact of drought and GFC, but we saw increase in agricultural activities across a range of agriculture. It wasn't dominated by any particular type of activity, and agribusiness is just an absolute mainstay of the rural economy. And so we need to think of agriculture as important in its own right, but its connections to transport, to food manufacturing, to professional advice, agronomists, etc., is super important. The visitor economy is super important to rural Victoria. In some places more than others. It's as high as 24%. In places like the Borough of Queenscliff, it's as less than 2% in the Shire of Bloke. Just administrative and support services, what does that mean in normal talk? It means we've seen an absolute boom in building and cleaning and pest control and those sorts of residential commercial services. We've seen a huge growth in public administration and safety, public administration regulatory services. I'm looking at the room, that's you. But we've seen a huge boom in public order and safety, so police, prison officers, etc. While we saw a decline in manufacturing, and we've seen a decline in manufacturing overall, the whole state grew in terms of employment in food manufacturing, and rural Victoria was no different. So it's an opportunity for us. And again, if I go back to my earlier connection to about agribusiness, I'm sprinting along here. Workforce age is understandably older. I don't think I'm telling anybody anything new there. That's a breakdown of the growth rate in that sector and the age of the workers in that sector, if that's making sense. What we looked at was which sectors have above average growth rate in employment for rural Victoria and which have an above average workforce age. So we would see that those sectors are particularly exposed in terms of loss of people through age. How many are we going to lose? We don't know. There's no rule that says you must leave the workforce at a particular age. So a scenario might be if we see that order of people leaving the workforce the next 5 years, that's what we've got to replace. What we also know is there's 32,000 people aged between 15 and 24 who are yet to engage in the workforce. I'm not suggesting that we drag 15-year-olds out of school and put them into work, but we need to engage them into the story that there are jobs in rural Victoria. And the work that the Office of the Victorian Skills Commissioner has completed in the Mallee, the Great South Coast report was just released today, and Gippsland soon to follow, is that we've got inadequate resources in terms of career advice. So young people aren't getting the advice they need to make decisions about staying and working where they've grown up. This is, I suppose, the controversial bit, and I don't want to appear opposed, but this is the challenge. I suppose our challenge was, how are we going to deal with the workforce needs that we've got? If you're going to get someone to move from Melbourne, a worker or a business, there are a range of things that they have to do, and it's challenging. And there is an issue around the availability and, if not the affordability, of rental housing. It's very variable. Just as a show of hands, how many people think they've got a lot of available rental housing stock in their towns? So, there we go. So we're ready when you are website says, why don't you rent first? Should say, why don't you try and find a rental house first? Oh, sorry, I'm being a bit facetious. So a lot of people will go, you know what, it's just too hard. Paul flagged about migration as a key source of workers, and it is. And the Regional Australia Institute report, which we quoted in our report, makes a very important and pertinent observation. It says we need to make direct connections between migrants and employers. Newsflash, that's just not for migrants. We need to make those connections between anybody in Melbourne who wants to work outside of Melbourne and employers. One thing I just skipped over because I'm going at a slightly frantic pace before is, in terms of looking forward, one of the biggest problems we have is the labour market in rural Victoria is like labour markets anywhere else. It's like a pyramid, so like an iceberg rather. The jobs that we see advertised are just the peak. There's so many jobs out there that we don't know about. It's a big issue. Now, that's not a problem that's only in rural Victoria. That's a problem in any labour market, but it's a big problem. And in terms of helping people through those other issues, we need to expedite people through those other issues. I live in Ocean Grove. My oldest daughter was born in Sale. I used to live in Maffra. I used to live in the Latrobe Valley. I think sometimes we have a slightly romantic notion about how easy it is as an outsider to assimilate into a new rural and regional community. So if it's going to be a slow burn to get people out of Melbourne, and I'm all for accelerating that, don't get me wrong, then we've got to, if we're going to deal with our economic issues right here, right now, then we have to find them somewhere else. So how do we get people who already live in regional rural Victoria and engage them? I'm not going to go through that whole list, but we did the numbers on where people who live in rural Victoria work. As I said, many of the job opportunities are unseen. That's the most critical thing here, we need to understand what those are. Okay, I'll come back to that a little later. So we need to promote the job opportunities to these targets, including the people who already live in rural Victoria, and hence my comments about some of the young people before. We assume that if we drag people out of the regional cities into rural Victoria, it's easier to backfill into those regional cities because they're going to have high-speed rail and services and all that. It's easier to attract them into those locations. The biggest problem we have is that most of our businesses, as they are in most economies, this is again not unique to rural Victoria, is the vast majority of businesses are small. And they have limited resources, skills, abilities with regard to recruitment. So we've got an unknown job market and businesses who aren't good at recruiting, double whammy. In Melbourne, it's not such a big problem because they're bumping into each other all over the place, a bit more of a problem where it's a bit more isolated in rural locations. So if we saw a growth of those cohorts by 20%, then we'd see about 33,000 extra workers available to us, which is about equivalent to what we experienced in the last census period. So that's explained in more detail in the report, but a couple of things I want to flag is top line of the blue box, we've got to be better at identifying what those actual opportunities are, and we've got to be good at promoting that. You're in the market, as I understand, for a rural promotion program, and from my perspective, one of the key things we need to be having in the rural promotion program is finding out what those are and telling that story to people in Melbourne and other places. Augment the recruitment capability of rural businesses. I think I've explained why we have that in there. Housing I've spoken to. Transport for workers. So the transport system works really well if you're going towards a regional city or towards Melbourne. Doesn't work so well if you're coming back the other way. And we're working with investors now who will probably and already are investing in their own buses to be able to get workers to their sites, and we think there should be some support for that. If I come over to the yellow box, I think there needs to be a skew towards rural Victoria and some of those things. For example, right now, the federal government is offering $10,000 if you take on certain types of workers. That doesn't matter whether you are a business in metropolitan Australia, regional Australia or rural Australia. Our view would be, why don't we skew that to regional and rural? Do we really need all of that support in metropolitan Australia, for example? Thank you, everybody.
Andrew Mason, I'm the CEO for Crangamott Shire, but also a Rural Council Victoria board member. And I think it's fair to say that Rural Councils Vic has identified rural population and rural workforce attraction as a key root cause problem for a lot of what we're experiencing. And it's an issue that strategically we've had a major focus on and that the board has been very much focused on. And so we've had this terrific body of work that's been done. And we've got a plan for some future work, which I'll very quickly go through. But I guess what I'm very keen to sort of get you to do is in your package, there are these reports. I think it's really important that all of us are talking to our local members about the importance of this issue and about the importance of having, of Victoria in particular, having a rural population strategy. I think that there are a whole lot of things happening, but if it's not set within a sort of a coherent strategy, there is going to be problems with sustainability. So I would be urging the membership here today to be talking to their local members. There's resources available to help you with that conversation about why it's important, and certainly encourage you to continue the advocacy work. So what's coming up next? So as John touched on, we are in the market to engage some people to do a rural promotion program. By the nature of our budget, that is going to have to be quite targeted. It's not going to be a rural living campaign, but it will be a program that talks to people and key markets and key target markets around the opportunities that are present in rural Victoria. In addition to that, we are also going to be in the market looking for some assistance to help with doing a rural investment attraction program. Again, quite targeted, looking at opportunities for businesses that may be in metropolitan areas to how we can promote the opportunities to relocate to rural Victoria. And finally, the other one is that we know that we've got an ageing population that is sometimes seen as a constraint, but it can also be seen as an opportunity. If we can look at how we provide services and accommodation in rural Victoria for older Victorians, that in itself helps with the retention of a population, but also creation of jobs and job opportunities in rural Victoria. So that's the third piece of work that we'll be doing this year. So 3 pieces of work that are just about to start, and what I'd be hoping is that we'll be presenting back to this group, probably in the next year around how those projects are going and the information. But yeah, a key message is the work and research has been done. It's great work that's been done by Paul and John. We've provided it to you, but you're a key advocacy tool. We need you to be out there talking to state and federal politicians about these issues. So I'll keep it very short and snappy, and I think we're handing over to some questions to the panel.
Thank you, panel. Ron Janis from the Alpine Shire. An area there that I see is missing is the education and re-education of the workforce into our areas. So I recently went to a manufacturing forum in Wangaratta, and it was clear from the potential employers there, that they could not find the skill set that they want, and equally it was the local TAFE was also absent from that forum, which to me was a bit sad. So, as you say, the jobs are out there, but we need to also train the people into those skills, or retrain them, because in some of our country areas we are getting tree changers who are quite happy to be retrained if they can get the job that's available to them. And even with our own local government sector, we're not doing all that very well, in the fact that the rural councils that are here, how many of them can't find a decent planner or a decent engineer in their areas? And how are we going to address that as local government? We have a commitment to provide the right area or the right circumstances for growth in our area. And if we haven't got those people, we're actually slowing down that growth. So once again, working with education facilities, even to grow our own sector, is important.
Again, if I speak to that, I suppose there's two parts to that, is finding the workers, and I've already spoken about a focus that we need on identifying the jobs and helping smaller businesses recruit them. But you also mentioned training and retraining. At the forum in April, I cut it out of this one because of time, but you'll see in the report about the ratio of people who work in the tertiary and technical training sector in rural Victoria. While we saw an overall growth in employment in the education sector, we saw a decline of people working in that sector, and they're the people who work in TAFEs and universities and by and large are responsible for workforce training. The ratio of those people in that sector in Melbourne is about 44, 45 of one of those trainers to every 45 other jobs. In rural Victoria, it's one of those people to 275 jobs. So when you make the observation that people can't get access to training, that might give us an insight as to why. In regional Victoria, it's a little bit, it's about 1 to 46 or 47, but it really drops away in rural Victoria. So we've seen the current government say we're going to put more investment into TAFE, which is fantastic, but we've got to somehow make that more available to businesses outside of regional Victoria and metropolitan Victoria.
Just briefly to add to that, one of the actions in our action plan is to seek to address a weakness in rural Victoria, which is a lack of access to higher education through facilitating programs for direct training, particularly in sectors like the hospitality sector. You have often some larger anchor businesses that need access to greater resources, and providing the opportunity for those anchor businesses, whether it's in hospitality or any sector, to provide approved training through a training provider, but directly from the business to the workforce, especially those that are seeking to be retrained, is an opportunity that we see as a genuine opportunity for those training needs. So that is an action in our plan, and it's a very good point. It's a very big issue.
We've got a question over there. Golden Plains.
I guess you guys are getting used to me by now. One of the things with the Grove in the peri-urban, let's have a look at that situation there. If the land release continues like it is in the metropolitan area, they'll consume the people, the skills, the engineers, the planners that all of our councils require. So should we as a body be looking at state government, let's cap the land releases around Melbourne and push the releases out into the peri-urban, because if the people are travelling to the peri-urban to work, they will actually get sick of travelling and they'll actually start living there. And these are the kind of motivations you've got to start looking at, because otherwise it's not going to happen.
Most of our work relies on pull factors. So we're trying, and a lot of the research talks to the difficulty in forcing anyone to do anything they don't want to do. And that comes out time and time again in case studies. So if metropolitan Melbourne remains a major economic magnet, which we expect it to, it will be extremely difficult to restrict supply without dramatically impacting on affordability. But what some of the pull factors for regional and rural Victoria will be the spin-off of some of the challenges that are faced by metropolitan Melbourne. So as it continues to grow, in my view, and what we've set out in our report are the serious costs of congestion of metropolitan areas will start and are already starting to spin off into people looking to escape those challenges and those costs. And rural and regional Victoria's lifestyle benefits, peri-urban challenges notwithstanding, are likely to be very attractive to the very people that would otherwise be seeking metropolitan locations. So in my view, we haven't provided a lot of focus on Melbourne itself, and we appreciate that peri-urban Victoria is attracting most of rural Victoria's growth and is likely to continue to do, especially if there's generalised incentives in place. But we think the factors that of lifestyle and employment in rural and regional areas are likely to become more attractive as Melbourne continues to grow and the cost of congestion continues to escalate. So I suppose that those are the principles that we've based some of our pull factor work around.
Just very quickly, as we flagged earlier, we also see the peri-urban councils as being a potential market of workers for the rural councils that are nearby the peri-urban councils. So we looked at that. There's a significant opportunity to attract workers instead of commuting into Melbourne to commute into rural locations.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have to pull it up there. We've run over time a little bit. So there's obviously a lot of issue. Hopefully you share Rural Councillors Victoria's view that this is a key and critical issue. Again, point you to the documents, the resources that have been prepared. They're only useful if they're being used, and we'd be hoping that the membership at least has the time to have a look at them and then starts to promote them and help us do our job. So thank you very much. Myself and Marianne will obviously be around for the next to the end of the day. So if you've got any questions, please come and have a chat to us.